Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Modesty's Property Corner, Season 1, Episode number 25. And today we'll be discussing diversifying your property portfolio. How are you all on this lovely sunny day? It's really nice and sunny out there, and it's been like that for a couple of days now. And a lot of us here in this part of the world would wish it lasts as long as possible, because we've been looking forward to this holiday weather. Okay, so let's make the most of it by learning. Let's make the most of it by feeding ourselves with those useful information and knowledge that will enhance our property knowledge so that we can apply them to our daily property activities. I remain your man, Ikenna Umezudike of Modesty Property Consultants Limited. We are an estate agency business based in Luton in United Kingdom. So today I want to talk to you about diversifying your property portfolio. I just want to make you, help you understand more about this thing called diversification and how it applies to property investments. So first of all, let's look at the basics of diversification. And a lot of people will be asking, what is the diversification thing about, and what's the business of diversification with property? I'm going to link that up later on. But let's understand the basics of diversification first. You see, diversification is one second, sorry. Diversification is one of the basic elements of investments. Anybody who knows anything about investment will tell you that diversification makes investment thick. Diversification is that part of your investment principle that spreads the risk across your across your assets, that spreads the risk across your investment portfolio. So without diversification, basically what is going to happen is that the risk of your investment will be concentrated in either one asset or in one area, and it increases the risk on your investment if that risk is not spread across as wide as possible. So that's what diversification does. It takes the bulk of the risk and it spreads it across your assets, so that every asset in that portfolio bears its own share of the risk, so that one asset doesn't bear all the risk. And if that risk basically occurs, it's going to affect that asset, and if it affects that asset, then the whole investment comes crashing down. So you can see that that's the concept of diversification, taking the risk and spreading it across those assets, so that every asset will be contributing its own quota to the burden of the risk, so that one asset doesn't have to bear all the risk. And every investment has its own risk. There is no investment that is risk-free, and property investment is not an exception. So that's why diversification, as it applies to ordinary normal investments, it also applies to property investment, because property is an asset. So if you can spread your risk across, say, your stocks and shares portfolio, why can't you spread it across your investment portfolio? But the thing is, a lot of people do not know how to apply this principle of diversification to their property investment portfolios, and that's what we're here to address. That's why we're here to show you how, and along what lines the diversification can happen. So let's dive straight into these diversification strategies. And one more thing, just to let you know that you see this thing called risk. It's inevitable in every investment. You cannot completely eliminate risk in any investment. You can only minimize it and control it. So the more minimal the risk is, the more the potential of the returns on that investment being higher. So the lower the risk, the higher the potential return. That's the simple logic and simple mathematics of investment. And one of the biggest weapons that you can deploy to minimize risk is diversification, because as thin as you spread the risk, the thinner you spread the risk, the less potent the risk becomes. But if the risk comes together and become bulky and located and condensed in one area or one asset, it becomes stronger. But if you take that risk and then begin to spread it across and it becomes thinner, that risk becomes less potent. So that's the principle. That's what I need you to understand as a property investor, as a potential property investor, as per how diversification applies to your investment portfolio. So what are the different diversification strategies that you can employ or you can deploy as a property investor? So let's look at, we're going to be looking at 10 diversification strategies that you can deploy towards your property investments. Today we might spend time to look at all of them so that we can understand them, or we might just decide to do some of them today and continue next week as time would permit us. So first of all, let's look at diversification along geographical lines. Number one, diversification along geographical lines. You see, for example, in the UK here, the most common geographical line in the UK here is the north and the south. And if you ask anybody who is into property investment here in the UK, they will tell you that it's always, the consideration geographically is always between the north and the south. Not especially in England here, northern England and southern England. Or it could even be northern UK and southern UK, because the north even extends up to Scotland and up to Northern Ireland, right? In some cases. And then the south here, you talk about, things that are, the closer it is to London, the more southern it is. The further away it is to London, the less southern it is. So when you talk about the north and the south, it's a geographical line that a lot of people have based their diversification on. So some people who invest in the north predominantly invest in the north because the properties in the north, in the northern England, tend to produce more yield than properties in the south. So for people who are looking for properties that are cheap and that can give them more yield, they tend to move up north, because that's where they find cheaper properties and properties that can give them more yield. For those who tend to look for properties that appreciate quicker, properties that can give them more wealth and more equity within the shortest possible time, they tend to come down south. Even though the properties down south are more expensive, but they still feel that their aim of investment is to accumulate more wealth. So they will rather invest in properties that will appreciate quicker in value, either because they want to sell on and recoup that equity in the shortest possible time, or they want to leave that equity to continue to build until sometime in the future when they will need to take out that wealth and look after themselves. Still along that geographical line, some people invest or diversify their property investment along that geographical line in line with how far away the investment location is from London. Okay? Or how far away the investment location is from where they currently reside or their locality. So for example, I am living in Luton, and if I want to invest and I want to look at geographical spread, I could say, okay, let me not concentrate all my investments in Luton. I would like to spread my investments outside of Luton in other areas closer to Luton or further away from Luton that have different features from what Luton has. There are people who live in areas where there is no like major NHS hospital, and they are looking to invest in properties that are located close to a main hospital. So they might move away from where they live to go and invest in properties that are located places where there is a major hospital. So that is their diversification strategy. They might be investing in their local area for a particular benefit or advantage of that local area, and then they will decide to move away from their local area to go and invest away from their local area for an entirely different benefit for that. So it's another way of diversification. Some people look at geographical area from London. London is the capital city. There's so much money in London, and properties in London appreciate a lot quicker than properties in most places in the UK. So some people might say, okay, I want to invest in the capital city because I know that the yield is not fantastic, but the growth, the capital growth and the equity that I'm going to get within a very short time is great, and that's why I want to invest there. And then they go and they invest in London. So they will use London as their yardstick of measuring geographical locations, and then anything further away from London, they will be saying, if this is too far from London, I'm not investing. If this is close enough to London, I am investing, because I want all my investment to cluster around London and its environs. That could be their yardstick of diversification and how they wish to spread the risk across their properties. And this has become even more prominent during the pandemic. In the last couple of years, we have seen people who lived in London move out of London to go and buy properties. Because the pandemic hit, a lot of people were living in London because they wanted to live closer to their workplace. And when the pandemic hit, they now realized that they could actually live and work elsewhere. They didn't need to live closer to work because they work from home. So the way we work changed because of the pandemic. So a lot of people who invested heavily in properties in London or in the capital or in the cities, the value of their property dropped because the demand for properties, say in London and in the city, was not as high as it used to be. People were looking to invest or to buy properties further away. So the value of their assets or their property kind of dropped. Even though now those properties have picked up again, property prices in the city have picked up alarmingly quicker than most experts even predicted that they would come back. So the turnaround in city property prices has been, very alarming and very, very fast and quick, because people were thinking that it would take the city a long time to come back to its full potential, prior to the pandemic. But look, a couple of years after the worst of the pandemic, the cities are bubbling back again. They're bouncing back again. But it's just to give you that indication that some people diversify along that line of, away from the city or within the city, or how far away they wish to move away from the major cities, for example, London. Okay, so that's number one diversification strategy along geographical lines. The second diversification strategy is along property types. Some people diversify their property investment along property types. When I say property types, I mean things like houses, flats, bungalows. So you can see these different property types. They have their own unique features. They are different in their own way, in the way they appear and in the way they are built. Houses, flats, and bungalows, they are not the same. Bungalows serve a special kind, a particular kind of market and a particular kind of purpose. Flats, they serve a particular kind of market and a particular kind of demographic. Houses are more like general, but again, there are certain kinds of demography that prefer houses. For example, families. So some people invest and diversify their investments along these property types. So they might have a mix of flats, houses, and bungalows in their property portfolio. Or they might have more of houses, less of flats, and no bungalows at all. Or they might even have more of flats, less of houses, and a little bit of bungalows. So those are different lines again that people can actually diversify their property investments. The reason again being that they are trying to spread the risk. Remember that the main idea behind diversification is risk spreading. Spreading the risk across your different investment portfolios, so that if the risk occurs on one of the assets or one of the asset classes, the whole thing will not come down. It will not bring down the whole the whole property investment that you have. You do not want your property investment to be affected because one risk affected everything. For example, during the pandemic, immediately the restrictions for properties were lifted. People were rushing to buy houses. The demand for houses appreciated a lot. People were looking for more outdoor spaces. So there was less demand for flats and more demand for houses. So someone who invested heavily in flats and who bought a lot of flats, then the value of their flat or the value of their property then would have depreciated in value, and that's a risk that they took. But now we can say that that risk is kind of almost non-existent, because flats are beginning to bounce back again in the market. But there was a temporary drop in the value of flats because flats were of less demand in the pandemic than they are now, because people didn't want, just imagine another pandemic happens and they get stuck and locked down in the flat again for 3 months. They wouldn't want to imagine that. So but now people are becoming more liberal about whether it's house or flats, and the prices of flats are coming back again. But then that was a risk, because that risk affected a particular type of property, which is flats. Although it was temporary, but at that moment in time, if you had tenants who were living in flats and they moved out of that flat because they wanted to move into a house, because their experience of staying in a flat for 3 months during the pandemic or during the lockdown was not palatable. And then if you are struggling to fill that flat with another tenant, that is a risk, because as a property investor, you are losing money every single time that property is vacant. So it's a risk to you as well, because even if you wanted to offload it and sell it, then you would have sold it, at almost below market value or less than what it is worth, because it has lost value. So people diversify their property investment and their property portfolio along the lines of the type of houses that they invest in. So they might want to have a mixture of flats and a mixture of houses, or maybe with a tinkle of bungalow on top of it. There is also this general belief that flats produce more yield than houses, right? And that houses have lower yields than flats. It's not generally true. There are some houses that give you more yield than flats would do, but generally there is a belief that flats give you more. So people who want more yield or who are more interested in yields go and they buy flats. And people who cannot afford to buy a house might decide to use that money to buy a flat, because flat is cheaper. And that's where the yield comes from, because it's cheaper and therefore the mortgage will be cheaper. But the rent, the difference between what somebody who lives in a flat pays and what somebody who lives in a house pays is not really massive. So that is where the difference in the price, in the house prices, are massive. But the difference in rent are not massive. So that's why people who want to, who are more focused on yield will go and buy flats because they are cheaper, and the mortgage is going to be cheaper, and they are going to get more yields. But if you look at the administrative costs for houses, it might be cheaper than than flats, because for flats you're going to pay all the management fees, pay ground rent, and pay all that you need to pay, block management and all that. It involves a lot of administrative costs. But for houses, it might be cheaper to run in terms of administration. But that's not the major consideration. The major consideration is, how do you balance your portfolio so that the risk is spread? So if you have, some people might prefer to have some houses and some flats. For some people, they just don't want to have flats at all because they don't like flats. So what that takes us to number 3 strategy, diversification strategy, which is property styles. Number 3 diversification strategy is property styles. And when we talk about property styles, we now talk about terrace houses, semi-detached houses, detached houses, converted flats, and all that. So these styles are also a way of diversifying properties. There are some people who just don't like flats. So what they'll do, they will invest in houses, but they will invest in different styles of houses, because those different styles of houses have different features and have different attraction for maybe renters or for investors. So for example, terraced houses, they are more common among people who want to buy to rent out, because it's easy to rent out, and there are people who just want to rent terraced houses, and that's it. And then terraced houses, they tend to be cheaper maybe in rent a little bit than maybe semi-detached or detached houses. So because of those features that they have, they tend to be cheaper. And some people who just want to rent a house can rent terraced houses. So some investors, because terraced houses will cost a little less, they would rather go and buy terraced houses. The difference between a terraced house and a semi-detached house might be as much as £10,000. And for that investor, that £10,000, they would rather take it and put it somewhere else. So they would rather go and buy terraced houses than buying semi-detached houses. That's the way they want to invest. But then, to balance their portfolio, they might say, okay, I'm going to have a little bit of terraced houses. I know I just want to invest in houses. I don't like flats. I'm going to have a little bit of terraced, and then I'm going to have a little bit of semi-detached, and I'm going to have some detached houses, because I want to serve different markets. People who want to live in terraced houses might be different from people who want to live in semi-detached. There are people who want to go all out to look for semi-detached houses. That's what they're looking for. There are some who are just looking for detached houses. So by having those different property styles, you are catering for different markets, for different needs, for different individuals, for different personalities, right? And that gives you a variety of, say, tenants, a variety of income, because the income that this generates and the income that this generates might be different. So it's another way of diversifying your property portfolio. It could be along the line of property styles. And among those property styles also is something like, even if it's flats, there are purpose-built flats and there are converted flats. So some people who are looking for flats might even prefer to have a converted flat over a purpose-built, or a mixture of converted and purpose-built flats, because their portfolio is made up of flats. So they don't want that flat to just be all purpose-built flats. They want a mixture of converted flats and a mixture of purpose-built flats. But because of the title, the way the title is, or the ease of buying out the leasehold on one of them, there are different considerations that they might have. Because remember, the key thing again is minimizing risk. So each time you are thinking about diversification, what you should be thinking about is, what risk am I minimizing by adopting this strategy? What risk am I trying to eliminate by adopting this strategy? That should be the key basic thing at the back of your mind when you are thinking of diversification. You need to identify the risk, and then you make sure that your strategy targets that risk, either minimizes it or eliminates it if possible. Number 4 strategy, diversification strategy, is along tenancy types. Some people diversify their property investments along tenancy types. And tenancy types, you're looking at, something like students, like HMOs, like single lets. Those are different types of tenants. So people who are diversifying their property, they might be thinking in that line. Okay, in my property portfolio, I want to have some properties that cater for students, which means I can structure their tenancy within their term time. From this term time to this term time, it runs from maybe January to September, or from September to September. I will structure that, and then students, this is how I want to structure the cash flow. I want students to pay me 6 months rent upfront, because I like that kind of upfront cash flow. Or I know that students, their parents or their guarantors or whoever it is gonna ensure that their rents keep coming. There are different considerations. They might decide to say, okay, I want to invest in HMOs because I want the individual rents coming from the individual tenants living in all the rooms that I've rented separately. Yeah, and I want those HMOs to be occupied by single professionals. I just want professionals. I don't want students. I don't want unemployed. Some people might even just want the DSS, people who are on benefits, because they know how to manage that kind of market. Then they can also structure that and include tenants like single lets. They say, oh no, I don't need the headache of multiple tenants in my property where I'll be managing 6 tenants at a time. I want to manage just one tenant. I want to buy a single let property, a buy to let, and just rent it to one family. And that's my strategy. But just in case that strategy has a problem, I want to be sure that I have other means of cash flow that is coming in on a regular basis. Therefore, in my portfolio, I'm going to mix it up according to tenant types. I'm going to mix it up with students. I'm going to mix it up with single professionals. I'm going to have a mixture of families, so that these three kind of cash flows will be coming in at different times from different sources. If the student property has a problem and the cash flow is not coming in, I'll be sure that there's cash flow coming in from the families who have a stable income, or from the single professionals. If I have 6 of them, at least 5 of them will pay in at every single time. These are different because you've identified the risk. And if your risk is cash flow and you want to address cash flow, you might decide to spread your investments along tenant types to make sure that your property investment covers all those areas. Number 5, and the last one we're going to discuss today, because we're going to discuss the remaining 5 next week. Number 5 diversification strategy is management style. Management style. Diversifying your property along the management style strategy, has to do with how the property is managed. Okay, you can choose to invest. Your property could be hands-on management. It could be managed by a letting agent, or it could just be investment in funds, right? Hands-on management, a lot of people buy their property and they manage it themselves, right? Because they have the time, they have the skill, they have the expertise to do it, and they want to do it. They like being involved in the day-to-day running of their property. That's the way they like to manage their properties. Some people buy their properties, they don't have the time, they don't even have the skill. They just have the funds, they buy the money, they buy the property, and they hand it over to estate agents to manage for them. And the estate agents manage it, take their fees, give them reports, and that's it. For some people, they will even go beyond just giving it to estate agents. They will say, I don't even want to own any property, right? I just want to invest in a property fund, and let the fund managers go and source the property. Let them go and source the property, invest in the property, and just give me returns at the end of the year. So there are estate funds like that. There are property funds like that is completely hands off. You're not involved in sourcing the property. You're not involved in deciding who lives in the property. You have no business in the day-to-day running of the property. All you do is just you invest in that property fund. You invest in that property fund, and the fund managers do the rest. Okay, so that's another strategy of diversifying your property investments along the lines of how it is managed. So some people might want to balance their portfolio by saying, okay, I'm going to buy some properties and I'm going to manage them myself. Maybe the properties that are within his local area. He say, if I live in Luton and I buy any property in Luton, I want to manage the properties in Luton myself, right? And then the properties that I'm going to buy that are far away from Luton, I'm going to give them to estate agents to manage, yeah? And then if just to further protect myself against any unforeseen circumstances, I'm going to go and invest in a property fund, right? And then get the returns from that property fund, because that one doesn't give me any stress. But that's spare money that I've got, maybe even monies that are coming from his property portfolio. He might get them together and invest in a property fund where he or she will be getting returns every year or every quarter or whatever period that the returns come, because that is completely hands-free. So those are different areas that you can diversify, different strategies you can apply in diversifying your property. I hope this has been useful to you today. And remember, there are 10 points that we need to discuss, and today we've managed to discuss 5 of them. Next week, I'm coming back with another bumper 5, right, that you would not want to miss. So watch it next week. Join us again, same time, same channel, same station, same medium, and we are going to come here again and talk about the remaining 5 diversification strategies for your property investments. All right, take care, and please do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Right, go on to YouTube, Modesty Property Consultants YouTube channel, subscribe, and make sure that the bell is on.